I realized, you have to be prepared to do things if you really believe in them, even if you're not popular. You must be prepared to go ahead and believe that this is the right thing to do.
Hello, welcome to Transcending Boundaries. I'm Reeta Roy. My guest today is one whose life's work has redefined leadership, resilience, and advocacy on the global stage. Her name is synonymous with transformative impact. A pioneer for human rights, a fearless champion for climate justice, and an unwavering advocate for gender equality. She was Ireland's first female president, serving from 1990 to 1997, where she made history by breaking barriers and bringing bold ideas to life. In this role, she reshaped Ireland's presidency into a powerful platform for equality, justice, and national reconciliation. She was the first Irish head of state to officially visit Britain and Northern Ireland, and was at the forefront of international efforts to spotlight humanitarian crises in places like Somalia and Rwanda. Her journey took her to the United Nations as High Commissioner for Human Rights. There, she was a powerful, strong voice for investigating and addressing abuses worldwide. She integrated human rights into the fabric of the UN and laid the groundwork for today's ethical globalization initiatives. She has been recognized for her leadership and was awarded the US Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama. As a founding member of the Elders, she took her mission further, working alongside figures like Nelson Mandela and Kofi Annan, advocating for peace, ethical leadership, and action on pressing global issues. From Côte d'Ivoire to the Korean Peninsula, she has stood with civil society leaders and heads of state, leading dialogues on human dignity and justice. Please join me in welcoming a true trailblazer, Mary Robinson. Welcome, Mary, and thank you for making the time to be here today to talk about your life. We'll just get started.
Okay.
All right. I'd love to begin where it all began, which is in your home. You grew up, parents were doctors. It was probably a very full family with a lot of your brothers. Would you talk about those early days and what it was like growing up in your household?
Well, because the surgery was in the house, I was conscious of, patients coming in, ringing the doorbell and going into a waiting room, and the surgery was opposite the dining room. So it was all very intimate. And my mother didn't practice her medicine after 5 of us arrived in 6.5 years, good Catholic tradition. And she was also looking after my grandfather, who was living on his own in the same town, but not very well. And she was running the town, basically, all the voluntary activities, and she loved it. My father was more reserved and focused on his medicine. And, with 4 brothers, 2 older and 2 younger, of course, I had to learn about gender equality and human rights. But it was actually what my parents kept saying that had more influence on me, because they kept saying, Mary, you have every opportunity your brothers have. You're bright, you're doing well in school, you've got to believe in yourself, you have every opportunity. And Irish society was telling me something very different. Even, if you like, my brothers were altar boys. There was no such thing as an altar girl. And we were a very religious Catholic family. My grandparents went to Mass daily. We went every week on Sundays. And I had to wear this awful scarf in church. I was a girl. And there was no doubt in my mind that there was a difference. In fact, I heard my father say, with some irritation to my mother, because I listened to these conversations, and my father would say he'd just been at a poor home where there was a midwife, but he'd come as the doctor. And then the question from the parents, Doctor, is it a boy or a child? So even then, you knew the boy was what mattered. And that was, 80 years ago in Ireland. And so that brought me to a sense, my parents think I have the same opportunities. I know I don't, but that's something to work on. I have this inner sense of justice. And I think that's what carried me forward for the rest of my life.
Incredible story. Now, your parents obviously were great believers in educating you, just as they did your brothers. And there's a wonderful story that your father had to ask permission from the Archbishop for you to attend Trinity College. Your brothers were there. Tell us a bit more about that. Why was permission required?
Because without permission, if you were Catholic, going to Trinity was a mortal sin.
Aha.
And so my brothers, he got permission for them, my two older brothers who were also studying medicine. And then I came forward to study law with my younger brother, so the two of us. And my father, regarded it as just meeting with the Archbishop. He usually offered a glass of sherry, my father said. But the politics of it was very interesting. The Archbishop was a very powerful figure in Irish life, in Dublin in particular, and he didn't want well-known Dublin families to go to Trinity, which increasingly they were trying to do. So it was harder for the Dublin families. For rural families like us, it was much easier. It was just a glass of sherry with the Archbishop, and you got the permission. And then for my youngest brother, 2 years later, there was no permission needed because the Archbishop changed the policy. It was no longer a mortal sin.
No longer mortal sin.
Not very convincing from a religious point of view, but all about the politics of Ireland at the time and holding on to the Catholic University in Dublin, University College Dublin. Trinity was the Protestant university as it was perceived. A lot of students from Northern Ireland came down because of that.
Wonderful. But it must have been such a formative time. You did very, very well in school. You scored at the top of your class in terms of your subjects in law. And you also met someone special. Someone became love of your life and your husband.
Yes, my husband Nick and myself were classmates from the beginning in a 4-year course in Trinity. And in the first year, we both got first class honours together with two others, if you like. And the four of us went and had a meal together. And that's how I kind of got to know and kind of liked Nick. And I knew that he was dating all the pretty girls in college, which he was over the next 3 years. But I was a friend, and he was doing the posters. He was artistic and ultimately started life as a cartoonist. And he was collecting old satirical prints from the period, the golden age of caricature, as he would call it. And because he got money from colleges for the posters he was doing, he could take me out from time to time, but as a friend. And then I, for my part, was forcing myself to debate in college because I really wanted my voice to get out, and I was so shy. And I often say this to young people, push yourself sometimes, and I became better at it. And on one occasion, he came with me to the other university, University College Dublin, and I won the individual award. And he kissed me, and I was quite shocked. And he, from then on, pursued me, basically. And I said, no, I want to go to Harvard and get my master's, which I did. And then when I came back, he had qualified at the same time as me with a law degree, but he went on to be a cartoonist for the local Irish Times and other venues. And so when I fell in love with him as well. And when we started to tell my parents were not at all pleased, because I had become, in that year after I came back from Harvard in 1969, I became the Reed Professor of Constitutional and Criminal Law, and I also got elected to the Irish Senate for the university. There are 6 university seats, 3 of them for the university I was at. And all of that meant I was a senator and a professor, and therefore I was on a pedestal with my parents, I think, suffering from what I would call overlove.
Overlove. So they didn't want you marrying a cartoonist.
And a cartoonist who was known to have dated a lot of women, and who was also a Protestant. That was probably the least significant, but it was a factor, And so they opposed the marriage. It didn't come to our wedding. And I was already well known in my maiden name, Senator Mary Burke, because I had proposed family planning. And the Archbishop of Dublin had said that this would be a curse upon the country, which was heavy stuff, you know, when I was 25 going on 26. So we got married with all his family there. One first cousin came because I needed one family member. I told a brother who wanted to come, no, stay away. We'll keep the family together away. Because I knew after we married that my parents would be reconciled very quickly, which they were. And indeed, my mother used to joke that Nick was her favourite son-in-law. The fact that she could only have one
son-in-law.
Neither here nor there.
No, it's tremendous. Terrific story. You know, you've had such a career in the law, arguing cases in Ireland and in the European Court, and you faced incredible opposition, incredible challenges. How did you find it in you to take on these subjects and pursue what you knew was right?
I had this inner sense of justice, but I really was surprised at the way in which the decision to join with two other senators to introduce a bill in the Irish Parliament in 1971 to legalise family planning, I was quite taken aback by the response. It was, to me, unexpected because the law was a mess. Married women couldn't get the contraceptive pill unless they had written permission from their doctor that they had cycle regulation problems. And women used to joke at the time that it must be the Irish weather that we all have cycle regulation problems. You couldn't buy or sell a condom. It was against the criminal law, but it wasn't against the law to use a condom. So, you know, and there was a story of women going on a train to Belfast to buy contraceptives, including condoms and contraceptive pill. They weren't able to buy the pill because they didn't have a prescription, so they said, give us aspirin instead. They just wanted to demonstrate, you know. And but as Senator Mary Burke, I had become a notorious figure, and I became even more notorious as Senator Mary Robinson as the bill was introduced. And it didn't even get a second reading. It wasn't ever published by the Parliament. It was in every newspaper. Everybody knew that it was adjusting the criminal law to remove the criminal ban on condoms. I actually was affected by the hate mail that I got, and it kind of destabilized me. I remember walking down Grafton Street in Dublin, our main shopping street at the time, and being afraid that somebody was going to jump out and tell me I was a witch from hell, because that's what the letters were saying, that I was a terrible woman, that I was undermining everything that was good about Irish life in introducing family planning. And there was no social media, of course. This was letters, snail mail, as they call it now. And Nick burned the letters shortly after we married. And we both regret that now because, you know, we're archivists by instinct and nature. And it's a pity to lose that indication of just how much nobody wanted to talk about sex, nobody wanted to talk about family planning. It was just anathema to cross the political divide, basically.
Wow, and we're in such a different time today. Clearly passing that, just getting through that period of time meant that it fortified you for other things you were
Very much so. I realized, you know, you have to be prepared to do things if you really believe in them, even if you're not popular. You must be prepared to go ahead and believe that this is the right thing to do. And I, afterwards, when I had tough decisions to make, it was never so difficult.
It's a good lesson for all of us to know. Now, you are a trailblazing president, first woman president in Ireland. You came into office with a statement that Ireland was emerging, and you cast a new light to the Irish people about what the role of the president would be. Speak about that period. Here you are coming on the heels of a lot of vitriol, but you're coming into office with great popularity. What was that moment like?
I think what was significant for Ireland was that somebody with my background would be elected as president. The office had been underdeveloped, if I could put it that way. It had been, my 6 predecessors were men towards the end of their career who were happy to take this high-level post and not really do very much, but at a very high level. And the reason why I had accepted to be nominated was to say the president is directly elected by all of the people of Ireland, could do far more at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. And in my inaugural address, I tried to explain in detail how I would try to do this without knowing how I would do it. As I say, the fact that I, was considered as a lawyer who took progressive cases in court, a senator who raised issues that were opening up doors, if you like, the fact that I could be elected signalled that Ireland itself had opened up. And that, I think, was a very powerful moment for the country. I happened to sort of personify it, but it was much broader than me. And when I travelled around the country during the election campaign, I saw what was happening in Ireland. I saw that the Common Agricultural Policy had brought money into rural Ireland, and towns and even villages in Ireland wanted the facilities that the cities had, but they couldn't afford them, and the government wasn't going to provide them. So people volunteered, and they used an Irish word called mehel. Mehel is very like Ubuntu in Africa. It's neighbourly. It comes from the farming community. There'd be one tractor and workers in a field. My father used to point this out when I went on calls with him when I was a young girl. He'd say, look, they're in one field, but the next week they'll go to the next field, and if that farmer is sick, they'll still do his field or her field. It's usually his field. And I heard a lot of talk about mehel, the spirit of mehel clubs, and then I talked about it, which made me one reason why I became more popular during the campaign. People felt I understood what was happening, and I kind of evoked the spirit of doing for others and doing for community. And I visited a lot of communities to value what they were doing around Ireland. We had a map that showed a balance of both where we were going geographically and for what reason. So we balanced everything.
That's fantastic, amazing. So you must have met remarkable people.
Yes, and I also had opportunities to represent Ireland abroad in a different way. I said in my inaugural address, I had no idea what I meant, that I felt Ireland could, play a role in human rights. What did I mean? What kind of role? And then there was a terrible famine in Somalia in 1992, and I was able to go there and then go to the UN afterwards and speak in the United States about the situation. And after that, I was the first head of state to go to Rwanda after the genocidal killing, and I had opportunities. So it was kind of an interesting time to be able to represent locally, nationally, with state visits and incoming presidents, etc., the more normal traditional president's role, and then internationally to play more of a role also on human rights and humanitarian issues.
You were also the first head of state to go to Britain and to go to Northern Ireland regularly.
That was also really very important. It surprised me when I got a number of invitations at the end of the campaign, and just after I was elected, I was invited to go to Britain to get an honorary degree from Cambridge University, to work with Václav Havel on the vision for the Bank for Reconstruction of Eastern Europe, and to visit the Irish community. Both governments, both the Irish and British governments, didn't know how to handle this because none of my 6 predecessors had ever gone to Britain for anything other than maybe flying through Heathrow to go somewhere else, or private holiday maybe. And the reason was, of course, Northern Ireland. Under the Irish Constitution, I was the President of Ireland. But what about Northern Ireland, or the North, as so many people called it at the time? So that caused a problem. And it was really very interesting. I was eventually allowed by the Irish government, because I couldn't go abroad without their permission, to take the degree from Cambridge and to work with Václav Havel, but they didn't want me visiting the Irish community in London, because that was political. And so I accepted that time, because you've got to negotiate these things. Next time I said, anywhere I go, I visit the Irish community. And of course, they knew that I'd put a light in the window for all of those who'd had to leave Ireland. And that light took on a life of its own and helped us to shape the Irish diaspora. And then the policies to reflect that followed. follow the light.
That's a beautiful symbol.
Well, it taught me the power of symbols.
It is a powerful, powerful symbol. Let's go to the UN. When you were appointed High Commissioner for Human Rights, and you had to face formidable challenges because there clearly were opposing voices as well. You knew what you were getting into, and you went. Talk about what you encountered.
Well, when I decided not to seek a second term, I asked the Irish government to put me forward because the office of High Commissioner had suddenly become available. It was a new office. The first High Commissioner found the job intolerable and went back to be Foreign Minister of his country, Uruguay. So they were looking for a new High Commissioner, and the Irish government put me forward. I didn't actually know how difficult it would be. It was a small, underfunded office with huge responsibility. For human rights globally, for gender equality, rights of indigenous peoples, rights of people with disabilities. No funding, no anything. And I was appointed by Kofi Annan in September 1997. My term would have finished on the 3rd of December, so I left early to do this. That was a mistake, which I realized afterwards. A mistake. I should have told Kofi Annan to wait, but I didn't know if he would wait. And I didn't have any other option. So I was very keen to do this job. So I allowed myself to be bullied and persuaded and took the position in September. By Christmas, it had almost broken me. In fact, a brother who came home from New Zealand, a doctor, my eldest brother, said, "Mary, you are having a mental breakdown." And when I heard him say it, I said, "No, I'm not going to." And I threw away the sleeping pills that had affected me. Because what happened was I was working so hard and I wasn't sleeping. So I took sleeping pills and they compounded the problem. And I really was. Now, the reason I mention that is when I wrote my memoir in 2012 with my daughter, I didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to skip that bit. And she said, "Mom, I remember. You wouldn't even talk to us at times. You were in a different place." And I wrote about it with her help. And that was the most popular chapter in the book, that Mary Robinson could have health problems, mental health problems. I was very glad that having thrown away the pills and taken some time to rest, took a few more weeks holiday, I went back to the office determined to move forward. And we did, and I was very proud of how the office developed. But that moment was really important for people to, it taught me, don't be afraid to show your vulnerabilities. They can be as important as anything else.
It's a powerful lesson that we're not superhuman, that we're human beings trying to do incredibly important work.
Yeah.
When you came back to that office, refreshed, challenges were still there. Opposing forces to human rights were still present, but they must have been champions out there as well, who you met, who gave you courage and who you gave courage.
Yeah, there were two different kinds of champions. There were government champions. I could look to some European countries, I could look to Canada, I could look to Australia at times, to help me. And you need that support in the UN politically. But also, I would go to some of the worst places of, breaches of human rights, Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, Bogota, where people were being killed in such great numbers, to Chechnya. And I would come back energized because of the people I met on the ground, the human rights defenders. And I learned so much from, I was visiting to listen and then bring their story back, but they were staying and still continuing the fight. And that so impressed me and still impresses me.
Yeah, but you did tremendous work to give them a voice and give them a platform and to give them courage. Now, while you were at the UN, you started to hear more about this conversation around climate, all very scientific. What intrigued you? How did you get drawn in?
Well, the interesting thing is I didn't speak about climate at all during my 7 years as President of Ireland. And when I was in the UN, there was another part of the UN dealing with it, and I didn't relate it to my big portfolio. It was afterwards when I formed a small organization called Realizing Rights to work in African countries. And it was a pun on the word realizing, if you like, that everybody should realize they had human rights, and those with power should realize, meaning implement those rights. So Realizing Rights was a good title. And I started in 2003, and very shortly after that, 2004, 2005, I kept hearing women saying to me, is God punishing us? Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, whom I was helping in Liberia, saying, Mary, we had 2 solid rainy seasons. They don't come anymore when they should. They come at the wrong time. How can I mend my roads? I mean, that was the top down. But for the bottom up, it was the school is destroyed, long periods of flooding and then of drought and then flooding. How can we produce food? The terrible, impact that was already being felt, and most of all by women, because of the gender divide, the different social roles. They weren't at the table of decision making, and yet they had to keep their communities together. And so I started to talk about climate justice, and then I established a foundation on climate justice. And I remember my senior advisor saying to me, the word justice, Mary, is probably not such a good idea. Climate justice is a very minority issue for a few very left-wing groups, etc., around the world. I said, listen, I can't talk about it except through the lens of justice. That's how I came to it, working on human rights. And so we worked on climate justice, and I'm very glad now it has become such a mainstream, especially for young people, young climate activists. And they march for climate justice, and they're absolutely right. There's such injustice. The climate issue affects the poorest countries, poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples much earlier, much more severely, and they're not responsible. Another layer of injustice, which is a developmental one, which I think is really important. The advanced economies, we built our economies on fossil fuel. We should be grateful to the workers in fossil fuel, oil and gas and coal, and in this country, turf, peat. We need just transition, which we are practicing here in Ireland, I'm glad to say, in the Midlands, where the bogs, there's no longer a Board Namona, an official body developing the bogs, etc. But it's now being changed to getting different types of industry and nature-based solutions into the Midlands. And that should happen all over the world, just transition out of fossil fuel as quickly as possible. But it's actually not happening at the moment. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species that's going on. It's really, really worrying, the fragility of the ecosystems. I've learned this because I admired the work of Johan Rockström, the scientist who developed what he calls the 9 planetary boundaries, which hold the world together, if I could put it that way. And he explained that we've breached 6 of those 9 boundaries. But the good news is we recovered one of them, the ozone layer. You remember in the 1980s, we were all worried we might fry because this ozone layer was opening up. And we learned that it was certain chemicals. And we dealt with those chemicals with the Montreal Protocol and subsequent protocols. And the ozone layer is back where it should be. But we've breached others, climate being one of them, and the acidification of the oceans, and so on.
Right.
The world is at peril, and yet politicians are very short-term.
They are very short-term. Mary, I want to go back. I want to come right back to these boundaries in a moment. When you got into this whole area of climate justice, what you found were technocrats, people who were speaking about the science, but they weren't necessarily speaking about the human stories. And part of the drive for justice was to humanize the impact of climate change. How did you go about that?
Well, when I realized at my first conference on climate, my first COP was in Copenhagen in 2009, very male, very technical, very scientific, and nothing about people. I couldn't believe it. Nothing about gender. So the following year in Mexico, in Cancun, we formed a women's leaders group on climate and gender. And that women's group, which was ministers, women ministers of environment, of energy, and sometimes of foreign affairs, heads of UN agencies who were women, and my foundation was the secretariat of it. And we helped gradually work for the Gender Action Plan, which emerged and which we're still trying to put forward and struggling to keep on the agenda. And then, in various ways, I linked with other groups who were working on climate justice, and we got the issues more into the mainstream. But there's still not that full sense. I wish that I'd seen in COP29 in Baku, where I was, a sense when we were talking about climate finance, that this isn't charity for developing countries. This is trying to have a safe world for everyone. Implement the Paris Agreement. And economists told us it would cost 1.3 trillion for developing countries, investment in them. And part of it would be public money, and it should be at least 300 billion by 2030 and 390 billion by 2035. The most we could scramble was 300 billion by 2035, which is actually very late and very bad. And that made the countries of the global south so angry because they're very frustrated at the lack of a sense of justice. And I share that with them. We need to have a development justice to address the fact that we have worsened the situation of the poorest while we've been building our wealth. It doesn't take much to say, come on, we need to implement the Paris Agreement in accordance with what it costs. And that means major investment now in developing countries.
What can young people do?
Young people give me great hope because they're very connected, they're very knowledgeable. I was, bowled over yet again last week being on a panel with Shia Bastida, who's indigenous from Mexico. She's graduated from the United States. She's gone back to Mexico with a terrific youth organization that has youth from all over the world. She's so connected. And they are all, and she and I love being on panels together. And she mentors me as much as I mentor her.
Fantastic.
And it's a really two-way process because I don't have big social media platforms. She does. And I understand how much she talks about love apart from anything else. It's really interesting. And being indigenous, she takes all that wisdom, but also wants to link it with the advances that are taking place, the innovations.
So it comes back to this notion of guardianship, guardianship for the planet. And I'm back to those boundaries, the planetary boundaries. You are one of the guardians.
Yes, I joke that I don't actually like wearing hats, but I seem to acquire hats. And my latest hat is I'm a guardian, one of the 19 guardians of the planetary boundaries, and we're about to have a 20th. This is building on and has provided much more support for the work, the technical work of Johann Rockström and the Potsdam Institute in Germany, his colleagues. Looking at the way in which we really should think of the broad 9 ecosystems, if you like, that sustain the world. And to be in breach of 6 of those is really very serious. What we would like to see is, the world have chief scientific advisors, the way during COVID we had chief medical advisors. Do you remember?
Yeah.
We did what we were told because we were dead scared. We should be equally scared, but we should know what we can do. And what the Guardians are saying is the science is scary, especially when you look at it in the way of all the boundaries that we're in breach of, and that we're actually cracking up. It's like cracking an egg and we're inside. We need to realize we may not have a future for the human species. It may be as bad as that, or certainly the future will get very much worse for everybody living on the planet, and particularly those who are younger and those who are still not yet born. It's a huge responsibility of guardianship. And we know that it's also possible if we move faster into renewable energy. And actually what I've done now is work with another women leaders on Project Dandelion.
Tell us more about Dandelion.
You remember I talked about the light in the window and my belief in symbols. Well, I got frustrated that we actually need a sense of urgency. And how do we help politicians to take the difficult decisions? And I realized we're not connected. All of those who are working on the right side of this, and there are millions and millions of us globally, and the opinion polls say people want action on climate. That's what they say, but it's not happening. So the dandelion, I used to think of as a weed. I now think of it as a beautiful flower. It grows on all continents. It is very resilient. You can't get rid of it if you want to, because it'll keep coming back. It's got wonderfully deep roots, so it regenerates the soil. You can eat or drink every part of the dandelion. There's no waste. And how do you spread it? You blow. The children blow the seeds, 1,000 seeds for every dandelion. So we want to use it for what I call radical connection, radical communication, and radical collaboration between the indigenous who have the wisdom and who are saving the forests, young climate activists and others, business that's on the right side, philanthropy, farmers, fishers, artists, filmmakers, storytellers, so that we know our strength and that we move more quickly because we switch the money. And that's why the COP in Baku was so important, because we spend the money badly. Do you know, there are estimates of we spend one figure is we spend $1.8 trillion a year on what is harming us, and that is fossil fuel subsidies and bad land management. The International Monetary Fund says, no, it's 7 trillion if you take in the health costs and the education loss and all the other factors of, and the cost of rebuilding after hurricanes or destruction, etc., especially in the advanced economies now. So if we switched that money to incentivize, rush to this wonderful world, renewable energy, circular economy, green jobs, much fairer, the developed world will have the lights, the power, and because it will be natural, and the sun shines better in developing countries. And we need to get excited about this.
And we need to educate the world about this as soon as possible.
Yes, absolutely. And that's partly what the Guardians of Planetary Boundaries is about, with a whole lot of others. We want everybody to become a guardian of the planetary boundaries.
I'm going to cross over from being a guardian to being an elder.
Yes.
So you're one of the co-founders of the Elders, which is an extraordinary group of people, many heads of state, Nelson Mandela, Kofi Annan, and others who are working for peace in the world. What led you to co-found this group, and how did you connect with these individuals?
Well, I was lucky enough to be invited in 2007 to a planning meeting in South Africa in Richard Branson's Ulasaba estate, which was a very nice place, where we would have a group of us who were the original elders, Archbishop Tutu, his wife Grasa, Jimmy Carter. Kofi Annan joined us on that occasion by a screen, but he joined us for the launch afterwards. There were a few of us. We were launched on his 89th birthday a few months later, back in South Africa in July. But at that planning meeting, I was skeptical, to be honest, at the beginning. I thought, what is it? And when Madiba, as we called him, Nelson Mandela, came in and sat with us, and he said, be humble. When you go to a place, people there know far more than you do. Listen. Don't do things if others are doing them better. Choose sometimes issues quietly, use your quiet wisdom, but also speak out. And in particular, be on the side of those on the margins, be on the side of women, be on the side of youth. And this was, to me, a message for life. And I was very fond of our first chair, Archbishop Tutu. Our second chair, Kofi Annan, had been my boss when I was High Commissioner.
Yes.
And when he died suddenly, and I was with him just before he died, we were working in Zimbabwe to help a fraught election there, and he wasn't feeling well and got pneumonia and died very suddenly, really. And then I became the chair. I've just handed over the chair after 6 years to another wonderful elder, Juan Manuel Santos, who was president of Colombia and got the Nobel Prize for his work. And he has a very strong link with Mandela, who told him to make peace with the FARC. And that's what he did,
Wow, what an extraordinary experience. Yeah.
Yes, it's a great privilege to work with the elders. I remain an active elder. I mean, I haven't retired, but in fact, I'm going to be more active because I'm not chair.
Well, that seems like the causes are broad, incredibly important, and sometimes a lot of that work, I'm sure, happens behind the scenes as well, to mediate.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah, for peace. This is incredible. Mary, you have started centers. You and Nick started a center on law in European at the University of Ireland.
In Trinity.
At Trinity. You've established your own foundation for climate justice.
But it came to a planned end.
Nonetheless, you started and you've put forward movements, many movements actually in your lifetime, Dandelion being just the latest one. What's next?
Well, I think fulfilling a joint commitment between Planetary Boundaries, Project Dandelion, the elders, we were all working very closely together. I mean, that's what's very good about it. These are not in silos. They're collaborating to build this movement, a climate justice broad movement of awareness that connects us all to take the steps to move the money and incentivize us rapidly. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, I'll never use the initials for Irish reasons. The Inflation Reduction Act did incentivize clean energy, and it's gone into red states like Texas, etc. So even though we've now got a problem of President Trump back in office over the next 4 years, that's bad news for a lot of the things we're concerned about, not just climate, but human rights, governance, responsibility of CEOs, ESG and DEI issues. There's great pushback, and he will accelerate that if he, that's what he intends to do. His intention this time is very worrying, but there are so many people who are on the right side, and we need to grow and know our strength. And happily, the hats that I wear work well together.
Yes.
And for as long as I have my health, and so long as Nick's okay, I'm more urgent than I've ever been, more committed than I've ever been, because I know that the next 5 years are probably the most important 5 years in human history. In those 5 years up to 2030, we have to change radically how we run this world. And politicians have to wake up and understand why we need to do it, in order that we will be net zero by 2040, not 2050, in order to really have a safe world.
And not be fried in that egg.
Yes.
And not be fried. The role then and the message for young people, whether they're activists, whether they're students, whether they're early on into their careers, and the role of values and caring for others, caring for the planet. What's your message to them?
I think I'll borrow a wonderful phrase that Kofi Annan used a lot. You are never too young to lead, and you are never too old to learn. So it kind of cuts across all the generations. And when I say you're never too young to lead, the world is at some real risk now, and it will affect young people more than anyone. They need to be at the table. Happily, at the UN level, the Summit of the Future resulted, as we know, in a Pact for the Future, which acknowledged, much more than I've ever seen in a UN document, the role of young people to be co-decision making, co-deciders at the table. Take this opportunity. Push yourself and push those around you. You need to hear my voice, because this is the world that I've been inheriting. We have to admit, my generation, and indeed the generation after me, have to say we failed to actually do what we should have done. Let's listen to these young people, let's include them, and let's get faster to where we need to be.
And give them a chance to lead.
Absolutely.
And give them the chance to lead. Mary, thank you. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here on your 54th wedding anniversary. So grateful.
Thank you, Rita. Keep up your own good work.
Thank you. Thank you.
President Mary Robinson's life and career exemplify the profound impact that one individual can have on global justice, human rights, and climate advocacy. From law student to becoming the first woman president of Ireland, from professor at Trinity College Dublin to High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, from advocate on gender equality to being a globally recognized voice on climate justice, Mary Robinson is an outstanding example of transcending boundaries.